There's something about the way that the feminine, not only in women, but in all of us, has a capacity to stand on behalf of life and freedom that is very powerful and that resists oppression in a very strong way. And I think it's one of the great opportunities that we face as a species is the mobilization of women across difference and across issue areas, because we are unified in wanting to defend and protect life.
Welcome to The Regeneration Will Be Funded. My name is Matthew Monahan, and in this series, we're exploring the intersections of regenerative finance, technology, and our living planet. Created with Ma Earth, you can find all of our conversations and more at maearth.com. Thanks for joining us. Today's guest is Nina Simons from Bioneers. Bioneers has devoted over 30 years to highlighting breakthrough solutions for people and planet. Nina has a wealth of experience in the nonprofit space across many networks, including the philanthropic context, which we go into in today's discussion. We discuss trends like flow funding, collaborative and trust-based philanthropy. We talk about creating spaces for deepening relationships, feminine earth connection, burning times, transcending binaries, and other reflections from Nina's wise and well-informed takes on what it really requires to create collective healing in this time we're in. This conversation was recorded at Bioneers at the conference in Berkeley in April 2023. I'm really grateful to Nina for sitting down with us. Enjoy. Welcome, Nina Simons. Nina is the co-founder and chief relationship officer of Bioneers. Thank you so much, Nina.
It's a joy to be with you, Matthew.
Well, we're just coming off the conference. You must be feeling relieved and lots of different emotions. How are you?
I am feeling relieved, tired, and very exhilarated all at once, very full. Very honored to experience how this living system has evolved and what a kind of quantum leap it feels like this year was.
And
Yeah.
what were some of the highlights for you?
Oh, well, different ones. Let's see. The fact that our registration was 3/4 new people, that was really exciting, and that our age demographics came younger considerably for this year than they have been in years past.
It really feels to me, having had a relationship with Bioneers for a number of years, that, obviously there was kind of a moment of pause with the pandemic from the in-person events, and that the conference and the organization has just had a breath of new life, and it's kind of going through a resurgence, and the energy was just so alive. And that's not just my view. I mean, that was something I heard from a lot of people that were in attendance. You have a new location here at Berkeley. It must be exhilarating to just, have your baby that you and Kenny have been stewarding for decades, be entering this new chapter and feeling like, wow, there's really a tailwind.
Yeah. Well, that's really true. And for me, one of the most gratifying things has been that although we have long said that Indigenous wisdom and worldview laid at the heart of Bioneers, there was a way that it became fully manifest that clearly Indigenous people's worldviews and awareness were sort of center stage in a way that they haven't quite been before. And that was just incredibly exciting. And also, I think we were fortunate in that we received a large infusion of capital just before the pandemic. which allowed us to really make a shift into becoming the media company that we, as you know, have long aspired to be. And so it's been really exciting to see a lot of, experimentation and a lot of evolution in that way, and people discovering our work from around the world and becoming an online community as well as a face-to-face one. Yeah.
And we spoke with Kenny Ausubel, your co-founder, collaborator, partner, on this in depth about the conference and some of the pillars of Bioneers. So I'd love to pick up on that fundraising side, because I know this is something you and I have spoken about, and that's something that you obviously have to do as a nonprofit organization, and something that I find you masterful at, kind of holding the delicate balance of these conversations around money. So what's it like to fundraise for a nonprofit organization over 3 decades, and to be in this field of philanthropy?
Well, I've learned so much as the organization has evolved. So I knew very little about fundraising before we began, although as a social entrepreneur in the for-profit sector, I had experience there. But I really learned a lot, and some of what I learned from trial and error, and some from Lynn Twist, actually. And the biggest thing that I learned from Lynn was to hold the value of the opportunity for investment that I'm offering in fully equal relationship to the invitation to invest. And I think we've been very fortunate with Bioneers, because both Kenny and I so deeply believe in the mission of it, that, I think I learned early on to shed the trappings of a cheerleader as a fundraiser, or, someone who is trying to talk someone into anything. And one of the pointers that I learned from Lynn Twist, again, was to offer anyone I'm talking to an opportunity to say, if this is right for you, great. And if it's not right for you, that's fine. It's only good if it's good for both of us.
Right.
And that just establishes a kind of equal footing, because in this society anyway, the class structures tend to be so rigid, and it's great to break out of them right away, and to carry the mission of the work with so much dignity that it's an opportunity for partnership, and that it's real partnership. It's not just financial, ideally. I feel very fortunate in that so many of our donors are friends and people who we really trust and really like and can be totally honest with. And so there's a quality of integrity that I think has been a great ally for us in our fundraising.
Yeah, having sat in, somewhat of a funder seat on the philanthropic side, I, sometimes do get caught in that trap of feeling like, I have power and I'm here to help an organization or something like that. But when I'm really in my highest self and in just full admiration and awe of an organization or a project, I have this experience where sometimes they'll say something like, thank you so much for, your support and da-da-da-da. And I'm like, no, thank you. You've created an opportunity where I can express my life's work in a way that is actually quite simple. I mean, when it comes down to it, it's just transferring funds. Like, all I have to do is move money from this bank account over to you. But I am capturing the essence of knowing that my life is making a difference. And that I'm actually able to support something that I believe in, because you are pouring all of your life's energy in this direction, and you are the one doing all of this hard work. And thank you for creating this opportunity for me. And I think that as a funder is what feels like equal partnership as well.
Yeah. Well, and I think what you're describing actually is a good description for a relationship economy, because really it's, what can we do together that we cannot do apart? And and that's a whole different relationship than the conventional, donor grantee relationship. And I think in many of the funder circles that I move in, there is a great move towards greater respectful collaboration and towards really investing in nonprofit work in a way that recognizes the needs of the nonprofit in a real way and does not try to use money as a control lever or, to say, I want to invest only in this part and only for this long. There are a lot of more progressive funders who are recognizing that what nonprofits really need is multi-year commitments and general operating support. And, so I'm thrilled that that's finally coming to the fore,
Yeah, it seems like we have a relic of the aid model where we expected that if you're raising money for ending hunger in some far off place, that the money would go towards the people who need it. And so there was a general aversion towards operating costs.
Right.
But, that structure is quite different in terms of aid than an actual, often young or fledgling kind of nonprofit entity that the whole work is to pay for the people and the staff in order to do, the fundraising needs to pay for the general operating cost. And so to start a mindset of like, well, what percentage are you using for operating costs is a bit naive. And yet so much of the world still works that way, where funders are earmarking for a specific program, a specific initiative, and not watering that core. Yeah.
Well, and I think, you probably recall as a prior board member of Bioneers that part of our premise about our relationship to our board is not dissimilar to how we relate to our funding base and our funder allies, in that, we kind of take the approach of, we want you to invest in our organization's leadership and not, to think that you're aiding us and that we need you to tell us what to do or how to operate. Because actually we may make mistakes, everyone does, but we want you to trust us.
Right.
And that's, again, a different relationship. And it removes some of the hierarchical and implicit biases that our culture is so rife with right now and that we need to transcend.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And you mentioned the multi-year funding, and it's just so obvious. Like anyone who's tried to run a budget or an organization and you want to hire people, like, how can you do it with only a 1-year time frame?
Right. Exactly.
And so if endowments that are often being planned on multi-decade basis believe in a project and get behind an organization, why can't they give 3 years commitment, 5 years commitment, sometimes longer? Or at the very least, set up milestones to unlock funding that can be more predictable and goal-oriented. So you mentioned donor circles, and can you tell me a bit more about what is a donor circle and why have you found this format important in these relationships?
Sure. Well, probably about 20 years ago, one of our then board members suggested to me that I join a progressive Women Donors Network. It's literally called the Women Donors Network. And at the time I said, why would I qualify? And we had a regranting fund within Bioneers. And he said, well, that's why you would qualify, because you're giving away money and you have decision-making authority over it.
Can you explain what regranting fund
is? Of course. A regranting fund is when a donor gives a nonprofit organization money with the discretionary ability to reallocate that money to other worthy causes and partners. And so, in essence, it's a philanthropist deciding that they want to endow the capacity for philanthropy to a leader or leaders. And so we have had that blessing, and it's been an incredible blessing. And in many, many ways, partly because I think any time that you are consciously developing a particular kind of relationship, like a donor-grantee relationship, it's useful to be able to stand in both shoes, and to just experience what's it like on both sides. And so because we had this regranting fund, I was able to apply to become a member of Women Donors Network, which back then was a very small network of only about 60 or 70 women. And it was largely progressive women in the San Francisco Bay Area who had decided that they needed a network both to strengthen their own capacity to relate to the world as philanthropists, because in the US anyway, many women and many people of inherited wealth grow up with a lot of prohibition about exposing themselves publicly to be philanthropists. There is a real concern that it makes you a target, and that people will just relate to you for your money and all kinds of things like that. And so, they got together partly to strengthen their own capacities as people with resources, and to talk about issues like how do you talk to your children about inheriting wealth and things like that on a personal level. But then as the network grew, which it has over the last 20 years enormously, I think it's now about 250 members, it became more and more outward focused and more politically oriented. And it's what I've found, Matthew, is that I've had the opportunity to participate in 4 or 5 different donor networks. And each one has its own character and its own sort of sense of mission and values. But in each of them, there is an emphasis on upskilling the members, on everyone's learning, and on increasingly on collaborative funding, and on inspiring each other to give more and to give more wisely. And, for me, in the early years, it was interesting because the network that I was a part of was women who predominantly gave to social justice issues and had relatively very little environmental awareness. And so I literally had a friend at some point say, I want to give you a grant to stay a member of that network and be a mole on behalf of awakening them to environment, which was marvelous. And I did that, and loved it. And also to Indigenous issues and more to women's issues. And so it's been a place of a great deal of learning for me about issues that I hadn't known as much about before. It's been a place of developing greater compassion for what people with resources have to learn and have to go through in order to resolve some of their childhood issues and also come to peace with being someone who has resources at a time when the divide between those who have and those who have not is so great. And having a regranting fund has also helped me develop compassion for what is required to discern where to focus your attentions, energies, and resources in a way that is not only productive for the world, but for your own sense of life purpose and calling.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I definitely would never imply that, there's not a tremendous amount of privilege associated with having a lot of financial resources. And so, people who are not in positions of being resourced in this current modern capitalist system, first and foremost deserve our compassion and respect. But those with resources, I don't think it's often understood how difficult it can be for them. And I didn't inherit, money, but my heart goes to people who are inheritors the most in that realm, because it is such a quandary to face all of the different psychological, isolating, social pressures, commodification, projection, shame, and I do really see the value of spaces where folks can come together and just process a lot of this stuff so that they can be more effective. And, You know, what you said about the regranting, what I find so helpful when you're giving away money, even if it's just a tiny amount, is it kind of forces you to put everything through the lens of like, I remember my friend Joshua Weil, he had quoted, I think it was $20 to cure blindness of a child in I don't remember which country. And it's like every time he spent $20 on himself, he kind of weighed it against that, like,
Right.
you know, is this worth it, or do I actually want to donate that money? And it just kind of creates a bit of a self-accountability mechanism,
Yeah.
especially in this consumerist culture where you can be like, oh yeah, I want to stay at the fancy hotel, or I want to have the extra vacation, or, you know,
Yeah.
whatever it is, to really put your ethics and values at the forefront and go, well, I know that this capital can be used by these people, and I have a relationship with this organization or this project or this individual or this cause.
Yeah.
So yeah, I really resonate with that, the health and importance of being on both sides of the table.
Yeah. Yeah. And you know what I think you're speaking to also is that there has been a tendency in philanthropy for a long time for it to be very male dominated and very white dominated. And at least in this country, which is the one I know best, the culture of white supremacy is very deep in our bones. And, you know, I feel like I have been working for a long time to peel away layers of that conditioning in myself, even though, you know, I considered myself on the right side of those issues since childhood. But the conditioning is it's so deep. It's kind of in our DNA. So I think, and we're at a time of a lot of reckoning around that, you know. One of the things at the conference you asked me earlier that really touched me was that I've been learning a bit recently about birth justice and birth equity issues. And, you know, because of that, I was able to program 2 sessions, and each of them spoke about reproductive justice and birth equity. And the panelists were so moving, and realizing that in this country, you know, the statistics for maternal care and birthing among communities of color are horrifying. And so for many of these women who were African American midwives and, you know, medical professionals, they were saying, look, we have to invent the alternative system. This is not okay. And that what was powerful to them about being at Bioneers was that ordinarily this topic doesn't get discussed in an environmental justice conference. And from their point of view, they said, you know, if we change a mother's experience of her birth and the child's experience of coming into the world and the family's experience of that birth, that will help change the culture in a big way.
Right.
And of course, it was so moving to me because, of course, that's true.
Right.
And wow, are they having trouble finding resources?
Right.
And it's such a valiant cause, you know? And so I was really moved to be able to lift them up just a little bit, you know, and more next year. Yeah.
And Bioneers has a long track record of uplifting voices for women, people of color, indigenous voices, and you hold it so humbly. I'm curious, you know, what are some of the lessons you've learned in that work, and maybe some of the mistakes that you've made?
Oh, gosh. It's a really deep passion and commitment for me. And I think as I began to understand a while ago, probably 20 or 25 years ago, how my gender influenced my own way of understanding my own options and my inner voices and my self-imposed limitations, I began to have more and more empathy for how marginalized people in this country are treated and what their options are, and the kinds of insults and microaggressions that they face and dangers that they face practically every day. And for me, you know, it's probably a dangerous and a somewhat false parallel, but I'm going to say it anyway, because I do believe it, that being female offers a window on oppression. Because every woman alive on earth today has experienced having her voice discounted and her perspective undervalued simply by nature of being a woman. And then when you amplify that for other marginalized people from other marginalized backgrounds, it's really painful, because we can empathize and really have compassion for what that feels like. And that's not the future I want to co-create. So mistakes we've made? Oh, tons. You know, on a relatively superficial level, I think I've made mistakes by assuming that women from other cultures would be like me when they're not, right? I mean, I remember saying once that I grew up in a household where anger was not expressed, and that I imagined that that was true for most women. And I had an African American woman say, honey, that's not true for me at all. You know, in my culture, the women express anger easily and honestly and in the moment. And I found myself a little envious, but mostly realizing, oh, I have so much to learn. I think, I think that the combination of wanting to be a good white ally and still carrying the conditioning of a white supremacy culture is a tricky combination to navigate. And for me, what I've found is that, I've learned not to expect people of color to educate me. I've learned to take responsibility for my own education about my history, my lineage, so that rather than sort of approaching them to fill my cup of culture, I carry my own. I've learned that I have to be thin-skinned and thick-skinned at the same time, so I have to be really extra empathic and also not take things personally so much, because, we all carry this conditioning.
Yeah.
And to just really be kind about offering feedback and recognizing that we're all going to make mistakes. And I think one of the things that I've experienced a lot, which I write about in my book, is convening groups where I'm really seeking to create the conditions for a kind of experience of beloved community where women from many different cultural backgrounds, and this is true in Bioneers as well with all people, can feel safe and brave and comfortable being who they are. Because by and large, in our culture, this is not a safe place for them to be who they are. And so I think a lot of what I've learned is to relate to individuals as individuals and not as representatives of their culture, and to not make assumptions, and to really consciously practice humility. And, I'm finding the more I learn and practice becoming a better white ally for Indigenous people, I want to show up and offer to serve. What does that look like? I feel like I want to go to a friend who is doing a big land back project and just offer to cook for about 10 hours, because that's what they do, and it's about serving the community. And even with the Black midwives, they were all about community. And I loved, there was a moment in the conference which Rebecca Solnit, I think, quoted when she said, Bill McKibben has the best answer for what can I do about climate change, which is stop being an individual and think as a community, and I loved that. So, yeah.
Yeah, those are great reflections, Nina. Thanks for sharing that. I think back on some of my experiences where I unconsciously just took for granted the cultural norms.
Yeah.
And I really, I feel remorse about that because so much of our cultural norms are problematic and not empathetic to either women or persons of color, but in many different marginalized groups. Like in the corporate context, we don't. It's kind of like there's no honoring. There's not really a lot of honoring around childbirth. There's just like an HR lens of what is the, X weeks for maternity leave, and that's it. And, now having experienced birth more up close and just seeing everything that goes with that, and the first 1,000 days of a child's life being so crucially important, and how to create better spaces within an office environment for all of the practical needs around things like feeding and the actual 9 to 5 regimen not really being super compatible with what it requires to raise children. Or there being such a taboo to discuss women's menstrual cycle.
Sure.
Even in this moment, I find it hard to even like know how to speak it because it's such a taboo subject. But it's just like such a lack of appreciation and sensitivity from men, or with persons of color, just expecting them to, take the space the same as I would expect someone of any skin tone, because that's what was instilled in me, and just assuming that, well, we're all the same, we're all equal, slavery's the past. Like all of these notions where now I look back and I just feel like, wow, and it's still just such a learning journey, and that's what I appreciate about Bioneers, is that you get to hear voices, and it's in an environment that's really inviting, and there's not a lot of shaming or feeling like I'm made wrong to be there and to receive kind of these different voices and perspectives, but just such a greater appreciation and kind of empathy that forms.
It's just earlier today, a woman was citing a Guardian article to me about how women in the corporate world climb and are able to actually achieve parity in pay, in compensation, until somewhere between 30 and 35, where if they have a child, their compensation basically gets flat and never recovers after that. And, we need to have a culture where men can care for newborn babies as well as women, and where women aren't penalized for becoming mothers, for heaven's sake. It's crazy.
And I want to draw this connection back to climate and Earth, because it does seem pretty clear in the environment and discussions at Bioneers, but it certainly hasn't pervaded our mainstream consciousness that the way that women are oppressed is very much a mirror of what we're doing to Mother Earth, and vice versa. And I'm curious if you can talk a bit about that.
Well, sure. I feel like my own understanding of it keeps deepening and becoming more explicit in more faceted ways. I've recently joined an advisory council for a group called Daughters for Earth. That is a group raising funds to distribute to grassroots women working on climate justice issues all over the world. And apparently, the current statistics are that in the philanthropic world, grassroots women are receiving 2% of the funds that are allocated for climate justice. And meanwhile, there are studies up, down, and sideways from the UN to researchers that keep proving over and over again that the more you support the status of women and the leadership of women, every system improves, from the economy to education to the land use and water and air and all of those things. And so I find myself noticing more and more that, it's the indigenous women who are some of the fiercest land defenders all over the world, and young people, and people like Greta Thunberg, who, thank heavens, she's amazing, is doing what she's doing. And so I think there's a very strong connection between women and the earth and the earth's life support systems. And, I used to notice that when I was still menstruating, when I was really centered and balanced, my period would come in sync with the full moon very consistently. And that's not really surprising when you think that the moon can sway the tides.
Right.
And of course, we're all part of one system.
Right.
And my studies of history are revealing to me that, I do believe we are all living in a post-traumatic stress time. And I think that we are traumatized in many, many different ways. But part of what set me on a learning journey about how my gender was influencing my leadership and my capacity was seeing a film called The Burning Times, which is a film that's online, and it's a little dated, but it tells the story of the roughly 300-year period in countries throughout most of Europe, where somewhere between 50,000 and several million women were systematically tortured and persecuted, and many of them burned and killed for the supposed crime of being witches. And it's a time that the more that I researched and investigated it, what I found was that many of the systems of human civilization shifted during that time.
Right.
Medicine shifted, the wealth shifted.
Right.
There was much more wealth in the hands of women at the beginning, and much more in men's hands at the end. Land use changed and became privatized, and the enclosure system, moved land use from communal to individual. And in terms of spiritual practice, we went from, or our ancestors went from sort of versions of pagan religion that was very much tied to the seasons and Earth's fertility and cycles, and involved a direct experience of the divine. Everyone could have it, to a much more controlled religious system where access to the sacred was required mediation and could only be experienced through a priest and a church. And so I think that there is, we are in a time where we are reclaiming some of what was lost during that time of the plant medicines, the herbal medicines, the connection to earth cycles and to traditional or indigenous wisdom. And we're reclaiming some of that as we seek to reinvent human civilization in all its forms in order to adapt to what Mother Life is requiring of us, with the climate crisis. And not only the climate crisis, but species extinction and pollution and all the rest. So I think that women hold a real key to resolving some of the challenges that we face, and we also face many hundreds of years of embedded and implicit bias, and that's very much true in our financial systems.
Yeah.
But thankfully, a lot more women are coming into resources, either earning them or inheriting them, and are practicing both their investment strategies and their philanthropy very differently.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. We'll put a link in the show notes to that film, and just feeling that, and the population of the planet was much smaller at that time, so just really, like, if you think about the compounded effect of what that did in terms of the growth and evolution of our species and all of that systems that were embedded with these new imbalances of disconnection from the earth, and then we can kind of see the follow-on effects very clearly, as you described.
And the thing that I would add is just to say that during the Burning Times, 7 generations witnessed that, right? So that's a lot of generations.
Right.
And there were versions of it that took place in other continents around the world.
Right.
And now that science has proven epigenetic trauma, right? That when I saw that film, it was like 1994. And I remember just being flabbergasted that I hadn't learned about it in school.
Totally. That's what drives me crazy is like, you just don't get educated on this.
No.
Right.
And then, but at the same time, I felt like I knew instinctively that that story lives on in my bones. And that it was the first time that I had some gleaning of understanding of why I would be fearful about speaking my truth in public. I was like, oh, look, what a good reason, right? I mean, and I mean, if epigenetic trauma is real, which I'm pretty sure it is, and then it would be true that there would be trauma residing in all human beings, not just in women, right from that time. And certainly all humans with a genealogy tracing back to those regions,
Right.
you know, and I'm pretty sure that Africa and Asia and, you know, a lot of other continents have their own versions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'd love to bring the conversation back to the money part and how that shows up and maybe still maintaining through a gender lens. I didn't come prepared with all of the latest statistics on still the very unequal distribution of wealth between men and women, both
Right.
in the United States as well as globally. The very unequal distribution of the nonprofit capital you spoke to in terms of donations made. You said you're doing work with Daughters of the Earth. Justin Winters, we have an interview with her. She's a phenomenal, you know, leader, influencer, you know, person in this space. And yeah, just so grateful for her work. Can you share more about what you're seeing in this field of women in philanthropy?
Sure. Well, I mean, in my experience, different networks have very different personalities. So, for instance, at least thus far, Women Donors Network has been a bit more, even though they're progressive within a somewhat conventional framework. So there's a great deal of emphasis on electoral politics as a way to move the needle, as a way to affect change. And on social justice issues. There is environmental awareness that's there and growing, but not quite as much on how do we alter the economic system. And, you know, I was saying that at the last conference of that network, a small cluster of us came together and said, nobody on the program is talking about capitalism. What's wrong with this picture? Why aren't they? And then we started meeting because we were planning, like, how do we lift this up within this network? And found that we each had very different views about what the conversation needed to be. And that was fascinating because, you know, there was a woman who I consider to be a very skillful and strategic philanthropist. And she said, I'm not against capitalism. I'm just against monopoly. And she said, from my point of view, I'm an investor in many small businesses in my community. And I think that's a very valid way to influence the future of our region. And so I think there are trends towards more collaborative funding. I think people are coming to recognize the value of working in community in terms of how it can accelerate everyone's learning. And that's really great. And so there's definitely more looking to each other to be influenced and inspired. And a little more, I mean, you know, part of the way that a patriarchal system has influenced our financial systems is that by and large, at least again in the US, women have been socialized to be competitive with each other rather than collaborative with each other. And I think that's changing. Thank heavens, finally, you know, and I think that's where a lot of our power lies. So I think there's more collaborative funding, there's more trust and partnership really with grant partners rather than, donors and grantees, rather than the hierarchical structure. And there is more of women really owning their own authority as philanthropists, because for many of them, they were raised with financial advisors and raised being told you can't make these decisions.
Right.
And they're realizing that actually they can and they must. And that's really encouraging. And then in other funder networks, like my experience thus far with Solidaire, it's very exciting because I find that there is a great deal of attention given to cultivating the culture that can accelerate each other's learning and engagement. And someone will sponsor a webinar from a group that they're enthused about, and the group kind of collectively inspires each other to kick in to meet the goal of that organization, because if they were really moved by the presentation and the issue. So I think that's exciting. There are more experiments with flow funding, which is kind of identifying leaders in the field. Because part of the conversation in this country is currently that the people doing the work know what's needed better than the philanthropists do.
Right.
And so more and more there are advisory councils that are coming together, and literally flow funding, where a person or a foundation will raise funding and select. In New Mexico, there's one with 5 elder Native women from different tribal communities who are collectively deciding where money goes and how much to whom, and also cultivating the relationships with the people who they're giving to.
Is that kind of the same as regranting?
Well, the difference, it is kind of, although flow funding, well, I guess it is. Regranting is with an organization, and flow funding is often through individuals. So that might be a difference. And flow funding is a little more, they're both really trust-based, because they're really about investing in someone else's leadership. And, what I'm finding is just that as people are awakening more and more to the relationships between indigenous cultures and wisdom and land back and reparations projects and social justice work, they're coming together in study groups and working together to discuss and learn about, how do we become better allies, and what does it mean to become more conscious of what the embedded racist structures that exist within our culture, so that we can both help take them apart and become medicine for healing them and transforming them. So yeah.
I also want to just voice the more cynical, maybe male identified voice that I certainly see within myself as well, of that a lot of this can either get, really kind of obsessed with virtue signaling, or artificially just counting genders and and losing the weight of merit and the weight of kind of the more substantive conversation that underpins it, where we're just doing something because someone's a man or a woman. Right. What would you say to that kind of objection?
Oh, I would say it's a really valid concern. And that just because someone is in a particularly gendered body doesn't mean that they're either a good leader or capable, or that they're, I personally believe that we all have masculine and feminine within us, and that the more consciously we grow into our capacities, the more we can draw from any of that spectrum in ourselves. But there are a lot of women who are leading in very hierarchical, masculine, old school ways, and men who are ineffectual. And, and there's a lot of identity politics these days.
Right.
And there's a lot of what we often refer to as shooting across the circle, and some of that has come about because of a scarcity mentality
Right.
and because of many, many decades of not enough funding for work that's really important and really needed, and people competing, in an atmosphere of not enough and competition reigning.
Yeah, I'm glad you said the scarcity piece, because that's part of what I witness when people get turned off by this conversation. Is I feel like the root is a fear that it's zero sum, and so if you're directing funds or attention or positions to people through a lens that doesn't look like me, then it means less for me.
Right.
And whereas the overall message here is that we're trying to collectively navigate to a brighter future for all.
Yes.
And that all of our liberation is bound together.
Yeah.
And that we have to recognize the imbalances, the injustices, and the very real context that we currently sit within.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that zero-sum game is, again, a deeply embedded belief system. We call them BS around my house. And it's just not true. I used to think when I was younger that my predilection for win-win solutions was naive. And I used to have a lot of self-judgment about it. And as I've aged, I've come to see that, no, it wasn't naive. It's actually one of the universe's ways of showing me I'm on track.
Oh, wow.
Is, if something is truly mutually beneficial, then it's good, then it's right and real and has integrity.
Right.
And otherwise not, and that we can live in a culture that is, part of what I've found, Matthew, is that the work that I've done to cultivate close, real relationships with people of all backgrounds and colors and ages is some of the most gratifying work that I've ever done in my life. And it's felt risky at the time, but I'm so grateful that I had the commitment to do it. And more so, what I would say is that, one of my favorite inner benchmarks is still a quote from an Austrian physicist named Fritjof Capra, right? And Fritjof Capra says that the evolution into a society that is ecologically literate involves a shift from a focus on amassing things to mapping relationship. And that if, in fact, we are mapping relationship, that involves a whole different set of skills. And it has nothing to do with zero sum. And really, through the pandemic, one of the things that's been of greatest comfort to me is the web of relationships that I have in my life. So we may let go of some things in some ways in order to get to a viable future, but we will be wealthy in so many other ways. And I don't think people really grok that yet, but they're starting to.
Right. Yeah, they are starting to. And it feels to me like the conversation about capitalism, which you brought up, is loosening. Just within the last couple of years, it's almost like we have a little bit more room to breathe, where we can get into a bit more of a nuanced discussion about, well, are we talking about markets? Are we talking about monopolies? Are we talking about, nation state rules within one context or globally? Are we talking about the worship of capital itself, like the culture of capitalism? And once you start teasing apart, then you start finding all of these really, strong bonds of agreement between people from seemingly different sides of the discussion, when it's just about, I believe in capitalism. Capitalism is better than socialism. So if you imply that capitalism needs to go, then you're implying that, the evils of socialism are better. And like, this is just very naive debate.
Yeah.
And so, I want to bring that conversation about relationship and what else you're seeing in kind of this, what does post-capitalism look like? And what are some of the visions for a brighter economic system that can underpin our humanity and civilization?
Well, okay, I'll go there for a bit.
Small questions.
And then I want to go back to something you asked me
Okay.
about earlier, because I'm
Perfect.
realizing there's more I want to say about that. I'm not sure. What I do know is that I believe in and want to give my energies to co-creating a relationship-based economy. And there are some models that I've seen and know about that are really exciting. I think they involve more collaborative ownership. I think they involve, and cooperative ownership. I think they involve community reinvestment. And there's a wonderful model that I remember hearing about in Japan, where people who live in one city but have elder parents in another city can become members of a network so that other people who live in the city where their parents are can go grocery shopping for them or help take them to medical care treatments. And similarly, if you're part of that network, you do that for somebody else's elders in your community. You know, I dream towards a future where caregiving is really valued and education is highly valued. You know, I think I once went to visit a reservation in northern New York State of the Haudenosaunee people, and also known as the Iroquois. And they believe that, you know, the way you can see a culture's consciousness is through how they treat their children. And when I went onto their reservation, what I saw was a lot of relatively meager houses and a school that knocked my socks off. It was so beautiful. You know, it had mosaics on all the walls. It had fantastic arts and crafts centers and computer centers. And I mean, it was as or more beautiful than any private school I've ever seen. And I thought that, you know, that's part of our future. That I want to see happen.
It reminds me of, I heard something similar. I don't remember which culture or context, but it was, if you want to see what a civilization values, you look at the most advanced buildings. And then if you look through human history in that lens, you know, for a while it was churches. You know, in some cultures it was schools. And if you look at now, what are the buildings that have the most sophistication and structure and often the tallest and so forth? It's actually the banks.
I was going to say, of course it is.
It's the banks, or maybe the tech skyscrapers like Salesforce Tower. Right.
Yeah. But, you know, it's also the banks that are propping up the oil and gas industries at a time when, you know, at a time when it's obviously suicidal for our species to be doing that. And so, yeah, the structures.
Well, I will be the first in line to sign up for that world that you've just described, a relation-based economy, a relationship-based economy. I want to give space to what you mentioned previously. You said you wanted to come back to something.
You know, what I realized that I had missed when you asked me about the relationship between the feminine or female and the earth was that some of what I've been learning, Matthew, is just blowing my mind about how when corporations... I was invited to speak on a panel at the UN years ago, and it was a panel about women and extractive industries. And on the panel were me and 3 or 4 other women from North America. And after we all spoke and talked about how when oil and gas and coal companies move into a region, which often has been occupied by indigenous peoples, the first thing that they do is set up a man camp. And because of the way that the laws and the jurisdiction is set up in the U.S., men who rape Native women on Indian reservations cannot be prosecuted by police from outside their territory. And so what was described in this panel was this whole system of, you know, the corporations move in the man camp, rape.
What is a man camp?
A man camp is a temporary housing scenario where the men who are involved in drilling the earth for the oil and gas are housed. So a whole bunch of men get imported into the region who are not from there with no women. And they systematically, because they can, rape and abduct Native women, which causes the Native men to feel utterly powerless and impotent. And of course, the Native men aren't getting the jobs either. And so it kind of destroys the community by using the women as a weapon of war.
Wow.
And what happened in that panel was that, I mean, I kind of knew that about North America, but after we had finished speaking and we opened it up for Q&A, women stood up from all over the world, Matthew, saying the same thing is true in Portugal, in Africa, in all these different nations. And they said, this is exactly what's happening where we are. And it was so painful to me to realize how prevalent that pattern is. And the other thing that I wanted to mention was, so in a panel that I was just on that was about women starting revolutions, there is a pattern. And I was with Zainab Selby, who is an Iraqi woman who started an organization called Women for Women International, when she realized she was working with women who were bearing the brunt of warfare all over the world. And she said, what I saw was that, you know, the media covers the men on the front lines. The media doesn't cover the women who are holding life together behind them, right? There are many facets to what happens in war. And she said, but only one facet is the public-facing facet. And she said, people still die and get married and have birthdays and need their lives held together, or are, you know, trying to function amidst a war zone, and earn a living or whatever they're doing, or parent. And she said, I realized that they were basically invisible to the world, and that was part of how war works in our current civilization. And, you know, I'm just so aware with the war going on in Ukraine right now of how women become weapons of war, you know? And she said one of the patterns that she witnessed, because there are women starting revolutions all over the place. And so we were talking about that, how the incredibly courageous women of Iran have been protesting, even though it's life-threatening to do so, because they are not willing to live without their freedom anymore. And so there's something about the way that the feminine, not only in women, but in all of us, has a capacity to stand on behalf of life and freedom that is very powerful and that resists oppression in a very strong way. And I think it's one of the great opportunities that we face as a species is the mobilization of women across difference and across issue areas, because we are unified in wanting to defend and protect life, you know, and having you know, maybe it's part of nature's design, since women are biologically evolved for childbirth, right? To live through pain and hardship for a big enough purpose. Yeah.
So how do those of us who are men and in our masculine more often than our feminine, you know, show up better? And you know, you traverse many different worlds, whether it's in philanthropic space, the environmental space. You talk to people from different cultures around the world. Like, you know, what guidance or advice would you have, or what would you like to see more of from the men?
Well, I mean, I think we all have very deep conditioning about, with false definitions of what the masculine and the feminine are and what they look like. And what does it mean to be a good man or a good woman or a good human? I think we all have to be careful and cautious about binaries and recognize that we all contain everything within us, and that we're all on a learning journey to strip away what's no longer serving us and our future as a species, and to take the risk of being a little kinder towards other women and helping stand with them as allies in much the same way that we who have white skin need to learn to stand with people who have been marginalized for not having white skin as allies, and to lift up their leadership. And I think, just to circle back to the beginning, one of the most beautiful things to me about Bioneers and about being able to cultivate an organization for this long has been the opportunity to witness the flourishing of people who came to us as young, undeveloped leaders into full-blown, and to feel them just in their radiance, and in both our presenter communities and our donor communities and our staff. And that's a blessing of aging that I don't think we hear enough about. Yeah,
so well said. Other questions that I didn't ask, or things you'd like to share, final messages you'd like to leave us with, Nina? And before we do that, I have one, which is, I know that, we're producing a lot of interviews, but I know that my mom's number one click is going to be on this one. So I'm going to give a shout out to my mother and a hello from my mom to you.
I love you.
She adores you so much.
Oh, it's so mutual. That's beautiful. I think what I would offer, Matthew, is that I think you've heard either Kenny or I say at various times that we both believe, and many of us believe, that we're moving from an I culture to a we culture. And that part of that transition involves valuing relationship more than we have before and prioritizing it in a certain way. And I find myself aware that in the mainstream conventional culture that we've all been immersed in for so long, the relational has been the purview of the feminine and not of the masculine. And I think that it is a time for all of us to be investing in the between spaces, between individuals, between us and community, between genders, between races, between classes, because we need each other. And the more I'm understanding how deeply social we as a very young species really are, the more I think our survival depends on that. And that's a way that everyone, regardless of their gender identity, could be cultivating themselves toward better shot at a resilient and thriving future. Yeah.
Nina Simons, thank you so much.
Oh, my honor and privilege. Thank you, Matthew.
I hope you liked that conversation with Nina. Let us know what you think by leaving a comment below. Bioneers has a vast repository of learning resources available on their website at bioneers.org, where you can also sign up for the conference or consider making a donation. You might also be interested in checking out the conversation we had with Kenny Ausubel, co-founder of Bioneers, Lynn Twist, who Nina mentioned, or other discussions that we hosted at Bioneers. All of those conversations and more are available at maearth.com. Please like, share, subscribe, and we'll see you next time.